Good morning. Thank you for your time today. We're always grateful to be able to connect with you all. My name is Bruce Anthony, and I'm one of the trainers with CERVIS Technologies. So today we're going to discuss how CERVIS tracks and records hours for volunteers, how you and your volunteers can modify those hours, utilizing the volunteer sign-in console to track hours, and running reports based on volunteer hours. So we're going to start off today by talking about how hours are recorded or tracked within CERVIS. And really that discussion needs to begin with the topic of the difference between the different types of events and projects that you can create within CERVIS. So when you create a new event in CERVIS, there are 4 different types you can cycle between. You have normal events, time slot events, and custom events, and you also have service projects. So the first 3 are all event types. What we refer to as an event is any one-time or recurring opportunity that has a particular start and end time associated with it. It could have multiple shifts within that if you're looking at something like a time slot event where you've created multiple opportunities. But the important thing about these types for events is that they have a start and end time. So you're creating a shift when you create an event. And also when you create that shift, you're going to create, at the bottom of the page here, a number of default credit hours that event is worth. So if this is a 2.5 hour long event, you'd put in 2.5 hours here. This is always recorded in hours, not in minutes. So for events, you're creating shifts, and you're also defining how many hours that particular shift is worth. So that would be an event type. And again, there's a couple variants there. With service projects, on the other hand, you're not creating specific shifts. Instead, you're creating long-form opportunities that occur over a date range. So if you look here, there's a start date and end date. There's no times associated with this. So service projects would be a long-form opportunity, something like a mentorship program or a coaching program. It could be something like an office aide or an intern as well. But the idea behind a service project is that you're allowing volunteers to record activity over an extended period of time. So with a service project, you don't define a default number of credit hours because those hours are recorded as the volunteer serves them. And that could be a number of times throughout the years. When you create a service project, you do define how volunteers can record activity. So there's an option here that says log service project hours. The default for this is online, which means that volunteers can log into their account from home or on their phone, and they can just record their hours directly. This has to be recorded for hours that have been served, so they cannot be recorded in the future, but they could log in and say, today I worked for 3.5 hours and record that directly. Or they could log in and say, yesterday I was here for 6 hours. So basically they're just recording those hours directly with a particular date and potentially some notes as well. The on-site option here would allow volunteers to record hours using the sign-in console, which we'll talk about in more detail later, but essentially that allows them to track their hours as they are served. So they would basically sign in when they arrive or start to serve, and then sign out when they leave or finish serving. And that would record exactly how long they were there, and they wouldn't need to do any sort of check afterwards. Both, of course, would enable both of those options. Now, this is how volunteers can record their activity. As an admin, you can always record hours directly into a volunteer's account for a service project or through the project itself. It would effectively be the same way that volunteers record hours online here. So in either of these cases, whether it's an event or a service project, the hours are being recorded through the vehicle of a registration or through service project activity. And that's the item that ties the volunteer to that event or to that project. Now that registration, since it's tying both of those things together, means that both of those items are searchable, which also means that both of those items are reportable. So any search that you could run on the volunteer side of things can be transferred into a report. And vice versa, or likewise on the event management side, any search you could run for an event by any of its attributes, like the location, the date and time, what interest category it's a part of, or what keyword it uses, those can be translated into reports as well. So again, the main point of this is that hours are recorded via registrations, which tie a volunteer to an event, or service project activity, which again tie a volunteer to a service project. So that's how the hours are recorded. Let's talk about the sign-in console, which is actually another method of recording activity. So that's going to be found under the event or project management heading. You have event or project sign-in console. The sign-in console is a standalone kiosk that you can set up on any sort of internet-connected device. So this could be a tablet, a laptop, a desktop, any sort of internet-connected device, even a smartphone, although I generally recommend tablet size or larger, just to make it easier for your volunteers. But the sign-in console allows volunteers to track their hours in situ. So they would sign in when they arrive, sign out when they leave, and that would record exactly how long they were there. And this can be used with both events and projects, although as you might suspect, there is a difference between them just based on how those hours are recorded. So let's look at opening this sign-in console real quick. Again, that's under the event or project management heading. If we click on this option here, it'll bring up this dialog. There's a few settings you can modify, but more importantly at the bottom, there is a sign-in mode button and an admin mode. So admin mode should really only be used when you yourself are manning the console. This will leave you logged in as an administrator, which means you have access to your entire database still. So you wouldn't really want volunteers to have that per se. But if you wanted to quickly sign someone in or check who is signed in, this is a nice way to be able to do that. But let's go ahead and open this up in sign-in mode. So in sign-in mode, you can see that I've been logged out. There's no longer a login bar here. I can't go back to the main dashboard, and I also can't see who all is currently signed in. But any volunteer could utilize this to sign themselves in for a shift. So what they would do is just search for their name. From there, if they already have an account, they would see their name, and then they would be able to click on that. Otherwise, they can potentially create accounts as well. And there's a setting that allows that to happen. So there's a system setting that would allow volunteers to create profiles and register for events kind of on the fly. And that would enable this Add New Volunteer button. So if you're ever using the sign-in console and you don't see this option that has to do with that setting, please feel free to ask a question about that or submit a support request there. But if a volunteer does see their name, again, that means that they have an account. They would click on that. And then it'll ask them by default to verify their account just by entering the last four of their phone number. Once they've done that, then they can sign in. And of course, that indicates exactly when they've signed in. The system will say they've been successfully signed in, and they can take the exact same set of actions or same steps to sign out. So once that takes place, the volunteer's hours are recorded based on the time of sign in and sign out. And of course, I just signed in and out within 1 minute, so 0 credit hours were attributed, but it does record down to the minute. So that's kind of what the sign-in console functionality looks like. Now, again, this operates essentially the same for events and projects, but there's one specific difference that I want to point out, and that is with an event, again, you define a default number of credit hours. So if a volunteer signs in for an event and they never sign out, they'll still receive that default number of hours. So within Service, the way that the events will attribute the hours is that you create the default, and then volunteers receive that default, barring any changes being made. So there's no action that needs to be taken for you to give those default credit hours to volunteers for events. They'll receive them unless they've been removed from the event, if they cancel their registration or you mark them as a no-show, or if their hours are being modified directly by you, which we'll talk about in a minute here, or if they're being modified by the volunteer, signing in and signing out. So again, the sign-in console can be used to modify those hours by signing in and signing out for events. With service projects, that's also true. Volunteers can record hours directly by signing in and signing out. But an important difference to note is that volunteers cannot rely on a default number of credit hours for service projects. They should be signing in and signing out for service projects. If a volunteer forgets to sign out, then the system will just leave them signed in until they get signed out later by you or by the volunteer. If that happens frequently, you can actually set a system-wide default for service projects. Now that is a system-wide default. It's a setting in the system configuration. It's found under System Settings, It's towards the bottom of the page here, but that would be this enable sign-in console automatic sign-out. So this can be set to a particular hour value. Again, this only affects service projects, and it only affects the instances where volunteers have forgotten to sign out. If they do choose to both sign in and out, then it would record their hours directly, and this value would be ignored. It's not a cap. All right, so that's the sign-in console. I do want to talk about one variant of that, and that would be mobile sign-in. On any event or project, you can enable mobile sign-in. So when you create a new event or create a new project, there's an option partway through the page that says allow mobile volunteer sign-in. And this option can be set to any of the yes values here, and that would, of course, enable it. That would mean that when a volunteer registers for this event and they receive their confirmation email, inside that confirmation email would be a direct link to sign in for this event. So that's the mobile sign-in link. It's unique to that person. It's unique for this event. They can't use it for other people, and they can't use it to sign in for other shifts. But basically what would happen is when you turn this on, you can define a location radius, or you can tell it to ignore the location or any location. But when you define that, that link will be sent to volunteers. And then when a volunteer clicks on that link on their phone, it'll check two things. First of all, is it the day of the event? And then second of all, if you did select a location radius, they would have to be within that radius of your location address. So it is geofenced if you choose to do that. If the volunteer meets those two conditions, then they would be able to sign in and sign out, just like the standard sign-in console. In fact, those two do communicate back and forth. The volunteer could sign in on their phone, and they could sign out on the sign-in console, or vice versa. Now, I mentioned there are other options with mobile sign-in. There's any location or ignore location. These two would, as the name suggests, not take into account where they are signing in from or where they're signing out from. Any location would actually still store the GPS coordinates of where they signed in from and where they signed out from as sort of a safety feature, but it wouldn't geofence it. It wouldn't restrict them based on that. Ignore location would do exactly what the name implies. The location wouldn't take into account at all, and only the times would be recorded. So again, mobile sign-in does the same functionality as the sign-in console in terms of recording activity. Volunteers can sign in and out, and that would record exactly how long they were there. So, and just a quick note, I know I was talking primarily about events, but that is also true for service projects. All right, the next topic here is how to modify your volunteers' hours. So this is going to go into how you can change hours for volunteers on specific registrations in both events and projects, and then also how volunteers can do that themselves. So as an admin, you can always modify the hours after the fact. Nothing is locked. You always have access to change things. So for an event, there's really kind of one main way that you would modify hours. So we talked about the sign-in console. Obviously, that kind of modifies hours on the fly. But right now, we're talking about modifying hours after the fact. So if you go under the Event and Project Management heading into Search and Manage Your Existing Events, this is where, of course, your events are housed. And if you need to change the hours for a particular event or for a specific person within a specific event, all you would do is go into Manage the Registrations on that particular event. There's a quick action or a shortcut option for that on the main dashboard here. But you can also go into Manage an Event and get to it by that means as well. When you're looking at the list of attendees for an event, you'll see on the left-hand side there's a calendar icon. If you mouse over this calendar icon, it tells you when the volunteer was registered and by whom, but it also says click to adjust hours. So if you click on this icon, it brings up a dialog that asks you how many actual hours the volunteer should receive or how many actual hours they served. So this is the direct modification. You are not changing what was existing. You're actually inputting exactly what the volunteer is receiving. So if this was a 4-hour event, but this person stayed long, I want to give them 5 credit hours, I would just type that in here directly and then click Adjust Hours. When someone's hours have been adjusted, whether that was by you manually adjusting those hours or by the sign-in console, the color of this calendar icon will change. So we can see that in this case here. I do want to note too, if you are using the sign-in console, you will see an icon appear here telling you the date and time of sign-in. And if a volunteer signs out, then again, it will modify their hours. So it'll change the color of that calendar icon as well. And then on the right-hand side, next to each entry, there's a note option. And those notes will contain the time of sign-in and the time of sign-out. One other quick way that you can change the hours for an event, let's say the entire event went longer than you expected and you want to give everyone extra credit, then instead of adjusting each person's hours, what you could do is just modify the event in its entirety. So if we go back to the event options dashboard and then click to update the event information, in here you could just go down and change what we looked at earlier, the service credit hours. Let's say I want to give everyone an extra half hour of credit. I could just change that directly within here. Now that changes the default, which means that for any person whose hours have not been adjusted, they'll receive the new default. This can be changed, of course, after the event or before the event, and it'll change any report moving forward. But that does not affect anyone whose hours have already been adjusted by something like the sign-in console. So if someone did sign in and out, their hours are already being modified, so they won't receive this default. All right, so that's how you would change hours in an event. For service projects, you actually have kind of two different methods. You could either go through the volunteer database directly into a volunteer profile, or you can go through the event database directly into a service project. And it kind of depends on what your end goal is. If you're looking to modify hours just for one person, then you'd probably go through the volunteer database. If you're looking to modify hours for multiple people within a particular project, then obviously you'd go through then the service project side. If we look at the volunteer database side, if I click into search and manage volunteer database, I could search for the individual whose profile I wanted to modify. And then if they are registered for any service projects, you will see this icon that says log service project activity next to their name. And if you click on that icon, you can also get there from the main menu for the volunteer. But if we click on this icon, it takes us to a page where I can add hours at the top of the page. So this would be a way for me to directly add hours into this service project if I needed to go and backlog activity. But I can also through here see all of their recorded activity in service projects. And I can also adjust these. So on the right-hand side, we can see how many hours each of these entries is worth. And if I click on the arrow icons, I can actually adjust those hours the same way that we were looking at on the event side. And of course, any of these entries can be removed. If you select them, you can delete them directly from the volunteer's profile. So the same sort of option exists in the event management side for projects. If you go into search and manage existing events and you locate a project you want to work with, there's a similar icon for logging activity. And if you go in through that menu, this will take you to the page that, again, you can record activity at the top here. And below that, you can see all the activity that's been recorded. So you can see that for any individuals. This is sorted by name, but you can also sort by the service date or the credit hours. And then the same options exist here. You can adjust hours directly using these arrow icons, or you can select an entry and remove it at the bottom of the page. All right, so for volunteers, how they can record or modify their own hours. We talked about recording already, but let's go ahead and assume a volunteer's profile and see what it looks like from their perspective. So we're going to go into Annie Bell's profile. I just went on the main menu there to manage her account. And towards the bottom, there's an option to assume identity. This allows me to view the system from her perspective. So if I click on that option here, it takes us to this page, which is exactly what she sees when she logs in. At the top of the page, you can see there's a registration management section. So I can, of course, register for an event or view or cancel registrations. These would be my events. If we go into view and cancel registrations, there is no option here to adjust hours. Volunteers cannot modify their hours for events. This is something that administrators can do using the methods that we looked at previously, but volunteers can't adjust those hours. They can cancel registrations, so they can remove entries, but they can't make changes to them. With service projects, it's very similar. So they can go in, volunteers can record or update service project activity for themselves. Now, again, this is depending on how you set up the project. So if you created the project and don't allow volunteers to record hours online, then they wouldn't obviously be able to do this. But if you have allowed that, then they would be able to select a project here, enter the date, enter how many hours were served, add some notes, and then record the activity. Now below, we can see where those hours have been recorded. So we can see all of those entries. And you can also see that there is no option to modify the entries on the right-hand side like you see on the admin side. So volunteers can remove these entries, but they can't make changes to them. All right, I'm going to go ahead and revert my identity back. That can be done under account management here, or you can do that under the profile icon at the top of the page. All right, so that's it for how hours are modified or adjusted after the fact. I want to remind you again, of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those via the chat. All right, there's one last section, and then we'll be moving into a question and answer period. So the last thing we're going to be talking about today is reporting. Reporting in service is primarily done under the volunteer management heading in the report management section. There are several other places in service that allow you to download documents or reports about different aspects of the system, including exporting volunteer information, exporting event information, downloading rosters, different things like that. But primarily when you're talking about running hours reports, that's going to be done under the volunteer management heading in report management. So report management contains 11 different reports. We will not have time to talk about all of these today. There are a lot of functions within here. So if you have any very specific reporting needs, please feel free to ask about those through the chat or submitting a support request. We'd be happy to walk through that with you. We don't have time to go through all the functionality that exists within here, but I do want to point out some highlights. So at the top of the page here, you'll notice that there is a date range. So let's just use an example. If we wanted to run like a year-to-date report for all of my activity, obviously I would want to set the date range at the top here to the beginning of the year. So we'll just set January 1st here. The end date by default will be today's date. You could, of course, modify that if you want to view more or less information. There is a document preference option, so you can choose to prefer a Word document version or a spreadsheet version. Some of these reports require one over the other, but they'll generally tell you that. So once we've selected our date range here, then we can go and choose which report type we'd like to run. And I just want to give kind of a quick look at the different types in here. This first report type is unique. We'll be looking at this one with a little bit more detail in a moment. Below that, we have a few reports that are really designed to be kind of quick printouts. So 2 through 6 here are your hours reports that are really good quick printouts. If I want to view an hours report for my entire year to date, by interest category, for example. So interest categories being sort of like the foldering system that your events fit within. Let's say I wanted to run that for this year. I would just go down to report number 5. I can choose to show all interest categories, or I could filter by a particular one if I want to view only that category and its subcategories. But let's do show all here. I can choose my detail level, low, medium, or high. And then I can also choose to run it for a couple other attributes. But I'm going to go ahead and run this report here. Again, this is just a quick year-to-date report by interest categories. So it's going to download the document. I'll pull that across here. You can see this just gives me a summary. I ran it in medium detail. It gives me a summary for each event within each interest category. So I'm seeing sums for each of those. I'll get a total at the bottom of each interest category section. And then at the very bottom of the report, I will also get a grand total for the report. So there's a couple numbers here that I want to talk about. You have events, volunteers, registrations, and hours. Events represents both events and projects, and this would be the number of events and projects that took place during that time frame. One event is exactly what it sounds like. That could represent one time slot event with hundreds of shifts, but it would still be one event technically. So the next value is volunteers. This is the number of unique individual accounts in service that have registrations within the time frame that you've ran this, within the parameters of this report. So this number does not take into account any bulk group registrations. That's important to note. And the reason for that is because Service can't verify that those individual registrations from groups are actually individual volunteers. So that number is not counted in here. This is the number of unique individual volunteer accounts in Service with registrations within this report. Next is registrations, and this would be what I talked about, how hours are attributed. Those registrations and service project activity. Each of those entries counts as a registration. And then lastly is hours. That should be pretty self-explanatory. That's the total number of hours within this report for the time frame that I ran. All right, so again, 2 through 6 are just kind of quick printout reports with different topics and different kind of leading subjects. So event or project, it would sort by the name of the events or by the date and time of those. Volunteer participation sorts by volunteer name. You can sort by groups or interest categories, or you can do a yearly participation summary sorted by month. So again, these are kind of your quick printout type reports. These are generally well run as documents. The first report type, going back to that, is this custom participation report. This is a spreadsheet only option. And this is a much more in-depth reporting function. We do have a video that goes into this in much greater detail. So feel free to check out that on our YouTube channel. But basically, this report can be run based on queries in the volunteer management section, event management, group management, or reservations. So you can run searches in any of those 4 areas and then apply that search as the criteria for your report. You can also run searches in multiple of those areas and apply them all at the same time. So you can get very specific results from your reports simply by running searches and then coming in here and running a report based on those searches. You'll also see there's this selection field where you can choose exactly how much data from volunteer accounts and how much data from events you want to include within that report. And then I do want to point out at the bottom here, there's an option to save report parameters. If you have like a monthly report that you'd like to run and it has like a specific search or a couple searches and specific settings, you can go through and run that one time, get everything the way you want it to be, and then down here at the bottom, click on Save Report Parameters. That'll give you an option to give it a title. And then once you've saved those parameters, anytime in the future you want to run this report, you would just select Load Saved Report Parameters, pick from the list the named report that you saved. You would load those parameters. It makes all the changes for you, so it'll select all the items, run the searches in those respective areas, and then it will also allow you to then just set the date range and run the report. So you would load the parameters, set the date range, and then run that report. All right, there are a couple other reports in here that I just want to briefly mention. These are generally just more information about your system. They don't really contain hours information as much. So there's things like an email analytics summary, new volunteer report, service permission level. The last report actually does include hours information. That's volunteer participation by custom field value. This uses in particular custom selection list fields from your system configuration to run a report, and it'll sort volunteers by their responses. Okay, all right, so that is it for kind of the topics for today. We do have a little bit of time here for some Q&A, so I'll just see if there's any questions that would be good to pass on. Yeah, so there's a question regarding if the volunteer participated multiple times within a report, if that would double count them as an individual volunteer when we were looking at those numbers earlier. And the answer is no. The volunteer count in the report is based on the number of individual volunteers, not the number of registrations. The number of registrations is a different entry. So volunteers are not duplicated in that count. That is a true value of individual volunteer profiles, unduplicated. Yeah, and then another question just about the difference between the low, medium, and high detail reports. That actually changes per report type. So you might want to explore around with those a little bit, but I'll just give a couple examples here. We were looking at the interest category participation report. The low detail version of this, and this is true for most of these in general, basically just gives you the title of the report, the summaries for each of those sections. So in this case, it would give me a summary for just interest categories. It wouldn't tell me the names of any events. It wouldn't tell me the names of any volunteers. It would just give me the totals for those interest categories. And then, of course, at the bottom, a total for the entire report. Now, when I showed you this, I ran it in medium detail. What that showed me was, in addition to the totals for each interest category, it showed me the title of each event and a summary for each event within those categories. If I had run it in high detail as well, it would show every single registration. So every volunteer, every registration would have showed up in that report. As you can guess, that's a much larger report. There's a lot more information in there. Now, obviously, this changes per report type because the title of the report kind of drives what the detail level will give you. So like for volunteer participation, low detail gives you a sum for each person. High detail would show you every registration that each person had. So another question came in regarding the sign-in console and how to utilize that with groups. So the sign-in console can certainly be used with groups, and group registrations can be used in a couple different ways in that capacity. And it kind of depends on what your end goal is. If with groups you're looking to have every individual volunteer registered and recording hours kind of on their own, so you have their information independently, then you would be looking at using reservation codes and essentially saving spots for those sets of volunteers and having them record activity as they arrive through the sign-in console. That could be done day of. That doesn't necessarily have to be done beforehand. So you can do that with groups if you want to know who the individuals are. And in that case, the sign-in console functionality would be exactly the same. Volunteers would search for their own name. If they already have an account, they would use that. Otherwise, they would create a new account and sign in using that new account. Now, on the flip side of that, if you don't care to know the individuals, if you would rather just have a number, like a bulk registration, in that case, you can still use the sign-in console. What you would do is beforehand do a bulk group registration. A bulk group registration can be done by an administrator. So if we look at any event here, if I go into manage registrations, when you're registering volunteers, you can obviously register a volunteer, or you can register a group. I could search for any group by name and then say that this group is bringing, let's say, 15 people. This would be a bulk group registration. It's sort of anonymous in a sense because you don't know who those people are. But if I do this type of registration, it is affiliated with the group leader. And so the group leader, whomever is listed as the point of contact for that group, would be able to use the sign-in console on behalf of the group. So when they arrive, they could, when they choose to sign in, they would actually indicate that they're signing in for the group instead. And they would do that just by using their name. So because they are the leader or the contact for the group, that would modify what they see. But basically, when they sign in, they can also indicate exactly how many people are present. So they could say that, you know, there actually are 15 people here, or that there are more or less people. So another question came in regarding how to locate volunteers based on the number of hours served. And that's actually something that you would do through the volunteer management section in Advanced Volunteer Search. So in the Advanced Volunteer Search menu, hopefully you're familiar with this menu, but this basically allows you to search for volunteers using anything that you're recording about your volunteers. So if you're not familiar with this, I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's a really powerful tool. It allows you to find volunteers based on anything you're recording about them. And that includes things like their participation level. At the bottom of this page, there's an option to find volunteer participation options. And you can find volunteers that have served more than, exactly, less than, or between a certain number of hours or times between a certain date range. So basically, I could say, let's say I want to find volunteers that have served at least 100 hours since the start of the year. So I could say more than 99 hours, and then I would give for the date range, I would say between January 1st and today. If I wanted to include future registrations, I actually technically could do that. But let's say I just want to see people who have served at least 99 hours or more than 99 hours so far. Then I could run that search to do so. Now, this could be combined with other things as well. So I could find volunteers using other criteria, like if they have specific identification information on their profile, or if they live in a certain region, or if they've passed their background check or whatever else. So you can apply other criteria using any of these other fields in here but this would be where you would be able to run a search based on participation options. All right, so a question came in again just about reviewing the difference between registrations on a report and volunteers. So let's take a look at this again. I'm going to go ahead and actually run that report again so we can take a look at that. And I'm actually going to do this via the volunteer participation report. So we'll go ahead and open this up. I'm going to, again, just do year to date, and I'll do low detail. So if we run this report, this is going to give us a summary for each person. So if we look at this report, you can see it has each individual listed, and then it gives me the events participated in and the total hours for that individual. Events participated in is going to be their registrations, and that will also be at the bottom. So the registrations represents, again, every registration that that person had within any event, time slot event, normal event, custom event, as well as any entry in a service project. So anytime hours were recorded into a service project, that counts as events participated in, or at the bottom of this report, if we look, that would be registration total as well. So in this report, it calls it events participated in. Let's pull up the other one we had previously, the interest category participation report. I'll do low detail this time just to make it shorter. But you can see in this one, again, it has the events, volunteers, registrations, hours. So again, events is the total number of events. Volunteers is unique volunteer profiles. Registrations is, again, that total of every time somebody signs up for a shift. So if you have an event, let's say, where you have volunteers who could sign up for any of the days, Monday through Friday, every day of the week, something you have going on all year long. If you have a volunteer who signs up 3 times a week for an entire month, so let's say there were 5 weeks in that month, they've got whatever that would be, 15 entries. So that would count as 15 registrations. So that would be 1 volunteer, 15 registrations. So if somebody comes in 3 times in a week, that's 1 volunteer, 3 registrations. So that's what that registration value represents. Anytime hours are recorded. The volunteers represents every individual or unique account that's recording hours. So this is not bulk group registrations. It is just individuals who have their own profile. All right, I want to thank you all for joining again today. And just as a reminder, we will be sending the recording of this after the video, or after the webinar is done here today. You should get that later today or tomorrow. And that will include, obviously, the link to the recording. So thank you again so much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.